There are moments in life when you realize that what you believe to be your greatest strength has actually been your most dangerous weakness. If you have clicked on this video, chances are you carry within yourself a particular kind of awareness, a heightened receptivity to the world around you that others have labeled as sensitivity. Perhaps they have told you it is a gift. Perhaps you have told yourself the same thing. But I am here tonight to suggest something far more unsettling. Your sensitivity is not a gift at all. It is a trap. And until you understand this trap, until you see how it operates in the shadows of your unconscious, you will remain its prisoner. You have likely been told that your ability to feel deeply, to perceive what others cannot, to sense the unspoken currents in a room makes you special. The modern world celebrates sensitivity as if it were a badge of honor, a mark of spiritual evolution. But what the modern world does not tell you is this: every gift, when unconscious, becomes a curse. Every strength, when unexamined, transforms into its opposite, and sensitivity, perhaps more than any other trait, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. I speak to you not as someone who wishes to diminish your experience, but as one who has walked through the labyrinth of heightened perception and emerged with a different understanding. The sensitive soul is not weak, but they are often wounded. They are not broken, but they are frequently lost. And they are lost precisely because they have been taught to see their sensitivity as something pure, something noble, something that automatically makes them healers and helpers and harbingers of light. This is the first deception. This is where the trap begins. When you believe your sensitivity is inherently good, you stop questioning where it comes from. You stop asking why you developed this hypervigilance to the emotional states of others. You stop examining the childhood that taught you to read every micro-expression, to anticipate every mood shift, to become a barometer for the psychological weather of everyone around you. You forget that sensitivity, in its raw form, is often not a spiritual gift, but a survival mechanism born from necessity. The child who learned to feel their parents' anger before it erupted did not develop this skill from divine grace. They developed it from fear. The young person who became exquisitely attuned to the needs of others before their own did not do so from natural compassion. They did so because their safety depended on it. Their love depended on it. Their very existence seemed to require this constant monitoring of everyone else's inner world. But here is what happens when survival mechanisms become identity. They crystallize. They become fixed patterns that operate long after the original threat has passed. The hypervigilant child becomes the hypervigilant adult, but now they call it empathy. The anxious people pleaser grows up and labels their compulsive caretaking as spiritual service. The person who cannot set boundaries believes they are naturally giving. The one who absorbs everyone else's emotions thinks they are naturally intuitive. This is the trap in its most insidious form. It disguises itself as virtue. You must understand that the unconscious mind is a master of disguise. It will take your deepest wounds and dress them up as your greatest gifts. It will take your survival patterns and present them as your life purpose. It will take your unhealed trauma responses and convince you they are evidence of your spiritual advancement. And nowhere is this more true than with sensitivity. The truly sensitive person, the one caught in this trap, often finds themselves exhausted by the world. They walk into rooms and immediately feel overwhelmed by energies they cannot name. They form relationships where they give endlessly while receiving little in return. They attract people who seem to need them desperately, yet who rarely reciprocate the depth of care they provide. They find themselves constantly drained, constantly depleted, constantly wondering why their gift feels more like a burden. This is because what they call sensitivity is actually a form of energetic boundary collapse. It is not true perception, but rather an inability to distinguish between self and other. It is not compassion, but confusion. It is not wisdom, but wounding, expressing itself through hyperarousal of the nervous system. The trap deepens when the sensitive person begins to build their entire identity around this pattern. They become the friend everyone calls in crisis. They become the family member who smooths over every conflict. They become the partner who sacrifices their own needs to maintain harmony. They become the healer, the helper, the one who fixes everyone else's problems while their own life slowly falls apart behind the scenes. And because our culture celebrates this kind of self-sacrifice, because we have mythologized the wounded healer and the selfless servant, the sensitive person receives just enough validation to keep them trapped. People tell them how wonderful they are, how caring, how intuitive. They are praised for their ability to put others first, to sense what is needed, to be there in times of trouble. This praise becomes a drug, and like all drugs, it requires increasing doses to maintain the same effect. So the sensitive person gives more, feels more, sacrifices more. They push their boundaries further and further until they have no boundaries at all. They mistake this boundaryless state for spiritual openness, not realizing that true openness requires a strong container. They confuse emotional fusion with deep connection, not understanding that real intimacy can only exist between two separate whole individuals. The trap is complete when the sensitive person begins to attract relationships and situations that reinforce their pattern. They magnetize people who are emotionally unavailable because such people desperately need what the sensitive person offers: unlimited emotional labor without reciprocal responsibility. They find themselves in dynamics where their sensitivity is exploited, where their giving nature is taken for granted, where their empathy is used as a resource to be consumed rather than a gift to be honored. But here is the most dangerous part of the trap. The sensitive person often cannot see it. They cannot see that their relationships are imbalanced because they have normalized imbalance. They cannot see that they are being drained because they have accepted depletion as the price of love. They cannot see that they are trapped because they have convinced themselves that their suffering is service, that their exhaustion is evidence of their goodness, that their inability to say no is proof of their compassion. This is what I mean when I say sensitivity becomes a trap. It is not the sensitivity itself that is the problem. True sensitivity, conscious sensitivity, is indeed a profound gift. But unconscious sensitivity, sensitivity that operates without awareness or boundaries, becomes a prison. It becomes a way of avoiding the very thing the sensitive person most fears: the possibility of being rejected for who they truly are. You see, the person caught in the sensitivity trap is often terrified of their own needs, their own desires, their own authentic responses to the world. They have learned that their value lies in what they can provide for others, not in who they are as individuals. They have internalized the message that their own feelings are too much, too intense, too inconvenient for others to handle. So they turn their sensitivity outward, focusing obsessively on everyone else's experience while neglecting their own. This creates a peculiar form of spiritual bypassing where the person uses their focus here on others as a way to avoid the difficult work of self-examination. They become so busy tending to everyone else's garden that they never learn to cultivate their own soil. They become so skilled at reading other people's emotions that they lose touch with their own. They become so practiced at meeting external needs that they forget they have internal ones. The irony is profound. The very trait that the sensitive person believes makes them more connected to others actually becomes the thing that keeps them disconnected from themselves. Their sensitivity, which they imagine brings them closer to truth, becomes a sophisticated form of self-deception. Their empathy, which they believe makes them more loving, becomes a barrier to receiving love because they never learn to love themselves enough to require reciprocity. This is why your sensitivity is not a gift until you wake up, until you recognize the trap, until you see how your unconscious patterns are operating, until you understand the difference between true sensitivity and trauma-based hypervigilance. You will continue to suffer. You will continue to give your energy to those who cannot appreciate it. You will continue to form relationships that drain rather than nourish you. You will continue to mistake your wounding for your calling. But awakening is possible. The trap can be seen, understood, and ultimately transcended. The sensitivity that has been your prison can become your power, but only when it is conscious, only when it is chosen, only when it operates from a place of strength rather than survival. This awakening begins with a single terrifying recognition that everything you thought you knew about your sensitivity might be wrong, that the very thing you have built your identity around might be the very thing that is keeping you small, that your greatest perceived strength might actually be your deepest unconscious wound. This recognition is not comfortable, it is not gentle, it requires you to question not just your behavior, but your entire sense of self. It asks you to consider that the praise you have received for your sensitivity might have been keeping you trapped rather than setting you free. It demands that you look at your relationships, your patterns, your automatic responses with unflinching honesty. But this discomfort is the price of freedom. This questioning is the beginning of true awakening. And this awakening is what transforms sensitivity from trap to gift, from prison to power, from unconscious reaction to conscious choice. The awakening I speak of does not come with fanfare or sudden revelation. It arrives instead like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew, revealing contours and shadows that were always there but hidden in darkness. When the sensitive person begins to see their trap, they often experience what feels like a death. Not a physical death, but the death of an identity, the dissolution of a self-concept that has served as both shield and shackle. This death is necessary. It is the prerequisite for rebirth. But it is also terrifying because it means acknowledging that much of what you believed about yourself, much of what others praised you for, much of what gave your life meaning, was built on unconscious foundations. It means recognizing that your sensitivity, rather than connecting you to truth, has often been a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. The first stage of awakening is usually denial. The sensitive person resists the suggestion that their gift might be a trap. They point to all the good they have done, all the people they have helped, all the crises they have averted through their intuitive awareness. They cling to the identity of the healer, the helper, the one who sees what others cannot. They defend their patterns with the fervor of someone whose very survival depends on maintaining the illusion. But denial cannot last forever. Eventually, the cost becomes too high, the exhaustion too profound, the emptiness too vast. The sensitive person begins to notice that despite all their giving, they feel fundamentally alone. Despite all their helping, their own problems remain unsolved. Despite all their empathy, they struggle to feel genuinely loved for who they are rather than what they provide. This is when the real work begins. This is when the sensitive person must embark on the most challenging journey of their life, the journey inward. Not the comfortable inward journey of feeling everyone else's emotions, but the terrifying inward journey of encountering their own. Not the familiar territory of other people's needs, but the foreign landscape of their own desires, fears, rage, and grief. What they discover in this inner territory often shocks them. They find anger they never knew they carried. They find needs they never allowed themselves to acknowledge. They find a voice that has been silenced by years of prioritizing everyone else's expression. They find boundaries that were dissolved so long ago they forgot they ever existed. They find a self that has been buried beneath layers of adaptive sensitivity. This buried self is often raw, unpolished, unformed. It has been waiting in the shadows while the adaptive self performed its endless dance of accommodation. It carries emotions that feel dangerous, desires that seem selfish, opinions that might offend others. It is the part of the sensitive person that learned early to hide because it was too much, too intense, too inconvenient for others to handle. The process of reclaiming this buried self is not gentle. It requires the sensitive person to stop being nice and start being real. It demands that they stop being helpful and start being honest. It asks them to risk the very thing they have spent their lives avoiding, the possibility of being rejected, abandoned, or criticized for expressing their authentic nature. This is where many sensitive people get stuck. They catch glimpses of their authentic self but cannot bear the thought of disappointing others by expressing it. They begin to feel their own needs, but immediately suppress them in favor of others' comfort. They start to set boundaries but quickly dissolve them when met with resistance or guilt. They oscillate between brief moments of self-assertion and long periods of self-abandonment, never quite finding the courage to fully commit to their own liberation. The trap reasserts itself with new disguises. The sensitive person tells themselves they are being spiritual by continuing to sacrifice. They convince themselves that setting boundaries is selfish, that expressing needs is needy, that prioritizing their own well-being is somehow wrong. They use their sensitivity as an excuse to avoid the discomfort of standing in their truth, claiming they can feel how much their authenticity hurts others. But this is where discernment becomes crucial. True sensitivity can indeed feel the discomfort of others when boundaries are set or truth is spoken. But unconscious sensitivity mistakes this discomfort for proof that the boundary or truth is wrong. Conscious sensitivity understands that discomfort is often the natural response to necessary change, that people's resistance to your authenticity says more about their own trapped patterns than about the validity of your expression. The awakening sensitive person must learn to tolerate being misunderstood. They must develop the capacity to remain centered in their truth even when others react with disappointment, anger, or withdrawal. They must cultivate the strength to hold their ground when their old patterns scream at them to collapse back into accommodation. They must find the courage to be disliked for who they are rather than loved for who they pretend to be. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of breaking free from the sensitivity trap. Learning that love based on performance is not love at all. The sensitive person has often built their entire relationship to the world on the foundation of earning approval through service. They have confused being needed with being valued, being useful with being loved, being indispensable with being worthy. When they begin to withdraw this automatic service, when they start to express their own needs, when they stop being endlessly available for others' emotional emergencies, something profound happens. Some relationships deepen, revealing themselves to be based on genuine care and mutual respect, but others reveal their true nature as transactions, as arrangements where the sensitive person's worth was contingent on their willingness to give without receiving. This revelation can be devastating. It forces the sensitive person to confront the possibility that some of their most cherished relationships were built on exploitation rather than love. It asks them to consider that their sensitivity was being used against them, that their empathy was being consumed as a resource rather than honored as a gift. It demands that they face the uncomfortable truth that they have been complicit in their own depletion. But this devastation, painful as it is, clears the ground for something new to grow. When the false relationships fall away, when the performance-based connections dissolve, when the transactions disguised as friendships end, space is created for authentic intimacy. The sensitive person discovers that they can be loved not for what they do, but for who they are. They learn that their needs matter, that their feelings are valid, that their boundaries are sacred. This is when sensitivity begins its transformation from trap to gift, when it operates from a place of self-respect rather than self-abandonment, when it serves consciousness rather than unconsciousness, when it becomes a tool for truth rather than a mechanism for avoiding truth. The awakened sensitive person still feels deeply, but they feel their own emotions with the same intensity they once reserved for others. They still perceive subtle energies, but they use this perception to navigate their own life rather than to manage everyone else's. They still offer support and compassion, but from a place of overflow rather than depletion, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than weakness. This transformation is not a destination, but a practice. The old patterns do not disappear overnight. The trap continues to beckon, especially during times of stress or vulnerability. The awakening sensitive person must remain vigilant, must continue to choose consciousness over reactivity, authenticity over accommodation, self-respect over self-abandonment. They must learn to recognize when they are slipping back into old patterns. They must develop the capacity to course correct without self-judgment. They must cultivate the patience to allow their new way of being to take root slowly, organically, sustainably. They must trust that as they continue to honor their own truth, they will attract relationships and circumstances that honor it as well. The journey from trapped sensitivity to conscious sensitivity is not easy, but it is essential. It is the difference between living as a victim of your own gifts and living as a master of them. It is the difference between being consumed by your capacity to feel and being empowered by it. It is the difference between using your sensitivity to avoid yourself and using it to know yourself more deeply than ever before. Your sensitivity, once awakened, becomes a compass pointing not toward others' needs, but toward your own truth. It becomes a guardian of your energy rather than a leak in your boundaries. It becomes a source of wisdom rather than a cause of suffering. It becomes finally the gift it was always meant to be. But the path to this transformation requires you to face something that most sensitive souls spend their entire lives avoiding: the reality of their own darkness. You have been so busy tending to the shadows of others that you have never turned to face your own. You have become an expert in everyone else's pain while remaining a stranger to your own rage, your own selfishness, your own capacity for manipulation and control. Yes, manipulation and control. The words that make the sensitive person recoil in horror. But let me ask you this: what is it when you absorb someone's anger so they don't have to feel it? What is it when you anticipate their needs before they express them, thereby preventing them from learning to articulate their own desires? What is it when you make yourself indispensable to someone's emotional stability, creating a dependency that serves your own need to be needed? This is the shadow side of sensitivity that no one wants to acknowledge. The sensitive person is not always the innocent victim of others' emotional chaos. They are often the unconscious orchestrator of it. They create situations where their sensitivity is required. They attract people who cannot regulate their own emotions precisely because such people make the sensitive person feel valuable, important, necessary. The trap deepens because this dynamic is largely unconscious. The sensitive person genuinely believes they are helping. They feel the pull to rescue, to soothe, to fix, and they interpret this pull as evidence of their goodness. They do not see that this pull might be coming from their own unmet needs, their own terror of abandonment, their own addiction to being seen as special. But the unconscious always reveals itself eventually. It shows up in the resentment that builds when others don't appreciate the sensitive person's sacrifices. It appears in the anger that emerges when boundaries are crossed, even though the sensitive person never clearly established those boundaries in the first place. It manifests in the exhaustion that comes not just from giving, but from the constant performance of giving, the endless effort to maintain an image of selfless service. The awakening sensitive person must confront this shadow with brutal honesty. They must ask themselves the questions that their adaptive patterns have been designed to avoid. What do I get from being needed? How do I benefit from others' inability to handle their own emotions? In what ways do I use my sensitivity as a form of control? How does my role as the helper prevent me from having to be vulnerable and ask for help myself? These questions are not comfortable. They shatter the noble self-image that the sensitive person has carefully constructed. They reveal that even the purest motivations can be contaminated by unconscious drives. They force the recognition that the very thing the sensitive person has used to feel superior to others, their empathy, their awareness, their emotional intelligence, might actually be symptoms of their own unhealed wounds. But this confrontation with shadow is not meant to shame or diminish. It is meant to liberate, because only when you see the full picture of your sensitivity, both its light and its darkness, can you begin to work with it consciously. Only when you acknowledge your own capacity for manipulation can you choose genuine service. Only when you own your need to be needed can you offer help from a place of authentic generosity rather than compulsive necessity. The shadow work of the sensitive person often reveals childhood dynamics that were far more complex than they initially remembered. The parent who seems so needy, so fragile, so requiring of the child's emotional support may have been unconsciously training that child to become their emotional regulator. The family system that praised the child for being so mature, so understanding, so helpful, may have been exploiting the child's natural sensitivity for the adult's convenience. This is not about blame. It is about understanding. Most parents do not consciously set out to create overly responsible, boundary-less children. They are usually repeating patterns from their own childhoods, acting out their own unhealed wounds. But the effect remains the same. The naturally sensitive child learns that their value lies in their utility, that their worth is measured by their ability to manage others' emotions, that their own needs are secondary to everyone else's comfort. The adult who emerges from such a childhood carries these lessons in their body, in their nervous system, in their automatic responses to the world. They have been programmed to scan constantly for others' distress, to feel responsible for others' happiness, to believe that love must be earned through service. These are not conscious choices, but deeply embedded patterns that operate below the level of awareness. Breaking free from these patterns requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires a rewiring of the nervous system itself. The sensitive person must learn to tolerate the anxiety that comes with not immediately responding to others' distress. They must develop the capacity to sit with their own discomfort rather than rushing to fix external problems as a way of avoiding internal experience. They must practice feeling their own emotions without immediately seeking to discharge that energy through caretaking others. This rewiring process is often accompanied by profound grief. The sensitive person grieves the childhood they never had, the one where their sensitivity was honored rather than exploited. They grieve the relationships they must release, the ones that cannot survive their newfound boundaries. They grieve the identity they must shed, the role of the selfless helper that brought them both purpose and pain. But beneath this grief lies something else. Rage, pure, clean, necessary rage at having been conditioned to give their power away. Rage at the systems and people who benefited from their self-abandonment. Rage at themselves for participating in their own diminishment. This rage is not pathological, it is sacred, it is the life force that has been suppressed finally finding its voice. The sensitive person is often terrified of this rage. They have been taught that anger is dangerous, destructive, selfish. They have learned to transmute their anger into sadness, their fury into depression, their outrage into exhaustion. But this suppressed anger is what maintains the trap. Without access to their healthy aggression, they cannot set boundaries, cannot say no, cannot protect themselves from exploitation. Learning to feel and express anger appropriately becomes a crucial part of the awakening process. The sensitive person must discover that anger is not the opposite of love, but often its truest expression. That rage can be protective rather than destructive. That saying no with force is sometimes the most loving thing they can do, both for themselves and for others who need to learn to respect boundaries. This process of reclaiming suppressed emotions extends beyond anger. The sensitive person often discovers that they have been carrying not just others' pain, but others' unlived lives. They have absorbed not just emotions, but dreams, desires, aspirations that were never their own. They have become repositories for the collective unconscious of their families, their communities, their cultures. Part of awakening involves sorting through this psychic material and returning what is not theirs. It means learning to distinguish between their own authentic feelings and the emotions they have taken on from others. It requires developing what could be called energetic discernment, the ability to feel what is happening around them without absorbing it into their own system. This discernment is not developed through thinking, but through practice. The awakening sensitive person must learn to pause before automatically responding to others' emotional states. They must ask themselves, is this mine or theirs? Am I feeling this because it's true for me, or because I'm picking up on someone else's experience? Am I responding from my authentic self or from my conditioned patterns? These pauses create space for choice. In that space, the sensitive person can decide consciously how to respond rather than reacting automatically. They can offer support without losing themselves. They can feel compassion without becoming consumed. They can be present to others' pain without making it their own. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this awakening is learning to receive. The sensitive person has often become so skilled at giving that they have no idea how to accept support, love, or care from others. They are comfortable being needed but terrified of needing. They can offer help but struggle to ask for it. They can see others clearly but resist being seen themselves. This resistance to receiving is often rooted in deep shame. The sensitive person learned early that their own needs were inconvenient, overwhelming, too much for others to handle. They developed the belief that they must earn love through service, that they are only valuable when they are useful, that their authentic self is too intense for others to bear. Breaking through this resistance requires tremendous courage. It means risking the vulnerability of showing up as they truly are rather than as they think others need them to be. It means allowing others to see their struggles, their imperfections, their humanity. It means accepting that they might be loved not despite their flaws, but because of their wholeness, including their darkness. The journey from trapped sensitivity to conscious sensitivity is ultimately a journey home to oneself. It is the process of recovering the authentic self that was buried beneath layers of adaptive behavior. It is the practice of choosing truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, self-respect over self-abandonment. This journey has no final destination because consciousness itself is a practice, not a state. The awakened sensitive person does not become invulnerable to the trap. They simply become more skilled at recognizing when they are falling into it and more capable of choosing differently. They develop what could be called spiritual reflexes, automatic responses that serve their highest good rather than their oldest wounds. These reflexes include the ability to feel without fixing, to care without carrying, to love without losing themselves. They learn to offer their gifts from a place of overflow rather than depletion, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than weakness. They discover that their sensitivity, when conscious, becomes a source of wisdom rather than suffering, a tool for truth rather than a mechanism for avoiding reality. The paradox is that as the sensitive person becomes more boundaried, they often become more genuinely helpful. As they stop trying to fix everyone, they become more present to what people actually need. As they cease absorbing others' emotions, they develop the capacity to hold space for those emotions without being overwhelmed by them. As they learn to say no, their yes becomes more meaningful. This is the gift that awaits on the other side of the trap: the ability to be truly sensitive rather than compulsively reactive, genuinely empathic rather than unconsciously enmeshed, authentically helpful rather than addictively needed. It is the difference between being a sponge and being a mirror, between absorbing others' pain and reflecting their truth back to them. But this transformation cannot be rushed. It unfolds in its own time, according to its own rhythm. The sensitive person must be patient with themselves as they learn new ways of being. They must expect setbacks, moments when they fall back into old patterns, times when the trap reasserts its hold. These are not failures but part of the process, opportunities to practice self-compassion and recommit to conscious choice. The awakening of sensitivity is not a solitary journey. It often requires support from others who understand the process, who can mirror back the sensitive person's worth beyond their utility, who can love them as they are rather than as they perform. It may require therapy, healing work, spiritual practice, or other forms of support that help rewire the deep patterns of self-abandonment. Most importantly, it requires the sensitive person to become their own best friend rather than their own worst critic, to treat themselves with the same compassion they have always shown others, to extend to themselves the understanding, patience, and unconditional love they have freely given to everyone else. This awakening also requires the sensitive person to confront a truth that cuts to the very core of their being. They must learn to disappoint others, not from cruelty or indifference, but from integrity. The person trapped in unconscious sensitivity has built their entire existence around avoiding the discomfort of others' disappointment. They have shaped themselves into whatever form seemed most acceptable, most needed, most likely to maintain connection. But this shape-shifting comes at a devastating cost. When you spend your life becoming what others need you to be, you forget who you actually are. When you dedicate your existence to managing others' emotions, you lose touch with your own. When you make yourself responsible for everyone else's happiness, you abandon responsibility for your own life. The awakening sensitive person must learn to bear the weight of others' disappointment without collapsing under it. They must develop the capacity to remain centered in their truth, even when that truth disturbs the people around them. This is perhaps the most terrifying prospect for someone whose entire identity has been built on being agreeable, accommodating, endlessly understanding. But here is what the sensitive person discovers when they finally risk disappointing others. Most people are far more resilient than the sensitive person believed. The emotional fragility that the sensitive person has been protecting others from is often a projection of their own terror of abandonment. The catastrophic outcomes they imagine will result from setting boundaries rarely materialize. More often, relationships either deepen through authentic interaction or reveal themselves to have been based on exploitation rather than genuine care. There is a particular form of grief that accompanies this recognition. It is the grief of realizing how much life has been unlived in service to others' comfort. How many authentic responses have been swallowed to avoid conflict? How many genuine desires have been suppressed to maintain harmony? How many moments of truth have been sacrificed on the altar of keeping the peace? This grief is not self-pity. It is a sacred mourning for the self that was abandoned. It is the soul weeping for all the times it was silenced, all the occasions it was ignored, all the moments it was told its truth was too much, too intense, too inconvenient for others to handle. This grief must be felt fully, honoured completely, allowed to move through the system without being rushed or minimised. From this grief emerges something unexpected, a fierce protectiveness toward the authentic self. The awakening sensitive person begins to guard their truth as carefully as they once guarded others' comfort. They develop what could be called spiritual boundaries, not walls that shut others out, but membranes that allow connection while maintaining the integrity of the self. These boundaries are not rigid or punitive. They are fluid, responsive, intelligent. They expand in the presence of those who can handle the sensitive person's full truth and contract around those who would exploit or diminish it. They are not defenses against intimacy, but requirements for it, because true intimacy can only exist between two people who know where they end and the other begins. The process of developing these boundaries often triggers what feels like an identity crisis. The sensitive person has been so identified with their role as helper, fixer, emotional regulator that they genuinely do not know who they are without these functions. They experience a profound disorientation as they step back from their automatic patterns of accommodation and service. This disorientation is necessary. It is the ego dissolving its grip on false identity. It is the personality restructuring itself around authenticity rather than adaptation. It is the soul finally having space to express its true nature rather than performing whatever roles seem most likely to secure love and acceptance. During this period of restructuring, the sensitive person often experiences what could be called withdrawal symptoms. They feel anxious when they are not rescuing someone from crisis. They feel guilty when they prioritize their own needs. They feel selfish when they say no to requests for help. These feelings are not evidence that they are doing something wrong. They are evidence that old patterns are dying and new ones have not yet taken root. The sensitive person must learn to tolerate these uncomfortable feelings without immediately acting to relieve them. They must sit with the anxiety of not fixing others' problems. They must bear the guilt of disappointing people who have grown accustomed to their endless availability. They must endure the feeling of selfishness without rushing back into self-sacrifice to prove their goodness. This tolerance of discomfort is what builds new neural pathways. Each time the sensitive person chooses conscious response over unconscious reaction, they strengthen their capacity for authentic choice. Each moment they remain centered in their truth despite external pressure, they deepen their relationship with their own inner authority. Each instance they honor their boundaries despite others' resistance, they reclaim another piece of their abandoned self. But this process is rarely linear. The awakening sensitive person will find themselves cycling through periods of clarity and confusion, strength and vulnerability, progress and regression. They will have days when their boundaries feel solid and their truth feels clear, followed by days when they doubt everything and feel pulled back into old patterns of accommodation. This cycling is not failure. It is the natural rhythm of transformation. The unconscious patterns that have operated for decades do not disappear overnight. They reassert themselves, especially during times of stress or uncertainty. The key is not to avoid these regressions, but to learn from them, to use them as information about what still needs healing, what aspects of the old identity are still seeking expression. The awakening sensitive person must become curious about their relapses rather than judgmental. When they find themselves falling back into people-pleasing, they can ask, "What am I afraid will happen if I don't accommodate this person?" When they catch themselves absorbing someone else's emotions, they can inquire, "What is it about my own emotional state that I am trying to avoid?" When they notice themselves giving advice instead of simply listening, they can wonder, "What need of my own am I trying to meet through helping this person?" These questions are not meant to create shame, but to create consciousness. They transform unconscious patterns into conscious choices. They allow the sensitive person to see their behavior clearly without being consumed by self-criticism. They create space for different responses, for new ways of being in relationship with both themselves and others. As this consciousness deepens, the sensitive person begins to experience something they may have never known before: the peace of being authentically themselves. Not the artificial peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep peace that emerges when inner and outer reality align. Not the fragile harmony maintained through constant self-monitoring and accommodation, but the stable centeredness that arises from self-respect and clear boundaries. This peace is not passive or static. It is alive, dynamic, responsive. It allows for the full spectrum of human emotion without being overwhelmed by any single feeling. It can hold joy and sorrow, anger and compassion, fear and courage simultaneously without needing to choose sides or create artificial separations. From this place of authentic peace, the sensitive person's gifts can finally emerge in their true form. Their empathy becomes discerning rather than indiscriminate. Their compassion becomes empowering rather than enabling. Their intuition becomes a guide for their own life rather than a tool for managing others' experiences. Their sensitivity becomes a source of wisdom rather than a cause of suffering. The relationships in the awakening sensitive person's life undergo profound transformation during this process. Some relationships cannot survive the shift from unconscious accommodation to conscious authenticity. These relationships were built on the sensitive person's willingness to diminish themselves, and when that willingness ends, the foundation crumbles. This can be heartbreaking. People the sensitive person thought they were close to may withdraw when boundaries are established. Friends who relied on the sensitive person's endless availability may become angry when that availability ends. Family members who benefited from the sensitive person's emotional regulation may resist the change and try to guilt them back into old patterns. But other relationships deepen and strengthen. People who genuinely care about the sensitive person celebrate their newfound authenticity. Those who were unconsciously waiting for permission to be real themselves find courage in the sensitive person's example. New connections form based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. The awakening sensitive person learns to trust this natural selection process. They understand that relationships that cannot survive authenticity were not truly nourishing in the first place. They recognize that people who can only love them when they are self-abandoning do not actually love them at all, but rather love what they can extract from them. This recognition is both liberating and lonely. It is liberating because it frees the sensitive person from the exhausting performance of being what others need them to be. It is lonely because it means releasing connections that felt important even if they were ultimately harmful. The sensitive person must learn to hold both the freedom and the loneliness, understanding that both are temporary states in the process of creating more authentic relationships. As the sensitive person continues to awaken, they often discover gifts they never knew they possessed. Talents that were buried beneath the compulsive focus on others begin to emerge. Creative expressions that were suppressed in favor of caregiving start to find voice. Dreams that were abandoned to serve others' needs begin to resurface and demand attention. This emergence of previously hidden aspects of the self can be overwhelming. The sensitive person may feel as though they are meeting themselves for the first time. They may discover interests they never knew they had, preferences they never allowed themselves to acknowledge, desires they never permitted themselves to feel. This process of self-discovery is not always comfortable. The sensitive person may find aspects of themselves that contradict their self-image as purely giving and selfless. They may uncover ambitions that feel selfish, desires that seem greedy, preferences that appear demanding. They must learn to welcome these discoveries without judgment, understanding that wholeness includes all aspects of human nature, not just the socially acceptable ones. The integration of these previously disowned aspects of the self is crucial for the complete awakening of sensitivity. The person who has only identified with their light, their kindness, their helpfulness, must also embrace their darkness, their selfishness, their capacity for manipulation and control. Only when both sides are acknowledged can true choice emerge. This integration does not mean acting on every selfish impulse or abandoning all consideration for others. It means acknowledging the full spectrum of human motivation and choosing consciously how to express it. It means recognizing that even the most altruistic actions can be contaminated by self-serving motives, and that even apparently selfish choices can serve the greater good. The awakened sensitive person learns to work with their shadow rather than against it. They use their awareness of their own capacity for manipulation to recognize when they are being manipulated by others. They employ their understanding of their need to be needed to make conscious choices about when and how to offer help. They harness their knowledge of their own emotional patterns to navigate relationships with greater wisdom and skill. This shadow work transforms the sensitive person's relationship to their own humanity. Instead of trying to be perfect, they strive to be whole. Instead of attempting to transcend their human nature, they learn to work skillfully with it. Instead of denying their flaws, they integrate them into a more complete understanding of themselves. From this place of integration, the sensitive person's gifts can finally serve their highest purpose. Their sensitivity becomes an instrument of consciousness rather than unconsciousness. Their empathy becomes a tool for truth rather than a mechanism for avoiding truth. Their compassion becomes a force for awakening rather than a means of enabling others' unconsciousness. But perhaps most importantly, the awakened sensitive person becomes a living example of what is possible when sensitivity is consciously embraced rather than unconsciously expressed. They demonstrate that it is possible to feel deeply without drowning, to care profoundly without self-abandoning, to be open-hearted without being boundaryless. This example is their greatest gift to the world. Not their endless availability for others' emotional needs, not their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others' comfort, but their embodiment of conscious sensitivity. Their demonstration that awakening is possible, that the trap can be escaped, that sensitivity can indeed become the gift it was always meant to be. The journey from trapped sensitivity to conscious sensitivity is not a path that can be walked once and completed. It is a daily practice, a moment-to-moment choice, a continuous returning to authenticity whenever unconscious patterns reassert themselves. It requires vigilance without paranoia, discipline without rigidity, commitment without attachment to outcomes. The awakened sensitive person understands that they will continue to encounter situations that trigger their old patterns. They will meet people who attempt to exploit their sensitivity. They will face circumstances that tempt them back into unconscious accommodation. But they also know that each encounter is an opportunity to choose differently, to respond from consciousness rather than conditioning, to honor their truth rather than abandon it for others' comfort. This ongoing practice of conscious choice is what transforms sensitivity from curse to blessing, from trap to gift, from source of suffering to wellspring of wisdom. It is what allows the sensitive person to finally claim their full power while using it in service of truth rather than in service of illusion. The world needs awakened sensitive people, not more martyrs or people-pleasers or boundary-less helpers, but conscious beings who can feel the truth of what is happening and respond from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. Individuals who can hold space for others' experiences without losing themselves in those experiences. People who can offer genuine support without enabling unconsciousness. Your sensitivity, once awakened, becomes a contribution to the collective awakening of humanity. Your refusal to remain trapped in unconscious patterns gives others permission to examine their own. Your commitment to authenticity challenges others to question their own performances. Your embodiment of conscious sensitivity becomes a beacon for others who are still lost in the trap. But this contribution cannot be forced or performed. It can only emerge naturally from your own authentic awakening. It can only flow from your genuine commitment to consciousness, your real dedication to truth, your actual practice of choosing awareness over automation. The trap of sensitivity is real and it is widespread. Countless souls are caught in its web, believing their unconscious patterns are evidence of their spiritual advancement. But the possibility of awakening is equally real. The gift that sensitivity can become when conscious is profound beyond measure. The choice, as always, is yours. You can remain trapped in the illusion that your sensitivity is inherently good, continuing to sacrifice yourself on the altar of others' comfort while wondering why you feel so empty inside. Or you can undertake the challenging but liberating work of awakening, of seeing the trap clearly, of choosing consciousness over conditioning. The path is not easy, but it is possible. The journey is not comfortable, but it is necessary. The destination is not a final state, but an ongoing practice of choosing truth over illusion, authenticity over performance, self-respect over self-abandonment. Your sensitivity is waiting to be awakened. Your gifts are waiting to be consciously expressed. Your authentic self is waiting to be reclaimed from the prison of unconscious patterns. The question is, are you ready to wake up? The awakening I have described is not a gentle unfurling of petals in morning light. It is more akin to being struck by lightning while standing in a field you thought was safe. The conscious, sensitive person must confront a truth that shatters their most cherished beliefs about themselves. that their endless giving has often been a sophisticated form of taking, that their self-sacrifice has frequently been self-serving, that their martyrdom has been, in many cases, a performance designed to avoid the terrifying vulnerability of simply being human. This recognition arrives like a sword through the heart of the identity they have so carefully constructed. The person who believed themselves to be purely altruistic must face their own hunger for appreciation. The one who thought themselves naturally compassionate must acknowledge their addiction to being seen as special. The individual who considered themselves spiritually advanced must confront their use of sensitivity as a shield against their own pain. I have witnessed this awakening in countless souls, and it is never pretty. It strips away the comfortable illusions and leaves the person naked before the mirror of their own unconscious motivations. They discover that their empathy has sometimes been a form of voyeurism. They're helping a type of control, they're understanding a way of feeling superior to those they claim to serve. But this destruction of false identity is not cruelty, it is mercy. For only when the fabricated self crumbles can the authentic self emerge. Only when the performance ends can the real person take the stage. Only when the mask falls away can the face beneath be seen and loved for what it truly is. The process of this falling away often triggers what mystics have called the dark night of the soul. The sensitive person finds themselves in a wasteland of their own making, surrounded by the debris of relationships that could not survive authenticity, haunted by the echoes of a self they can no longer pretend to be. They feel lost, confused, bereft of the very qualities that once gave their life meaning and purpose. In this darkness, they must learn to sit with emptiness without rushing to fill it. They must tolerate the absence of their familiar role without immediately seeking a new one. They must endure the silence that comes when they stop constantly tending to others' emotional weather and finally turn their attention inward to their own inner climate. This inward turning is perhaps the most foreign territory the sensitive person will ever explore. They have become such experts in the geography of others' hearts that their own inner landscape feels like an alien world. They must learn to navigate emotions they have spent decades avoiding, desires they have habitually suppressed, truths they have consistently betrayed in service of maintaining external harmony. What they discover in this inner exploration often shocks them. Beneath the carefully cultivated gentleness, they find rage that could burn forests. Under the practiced understanding, they uncover judgment sharp enough to cut stone. Behind the endless patience, they locate fury at having been taken for granted, exploited, consumed by those who never thought to ask what the sensitive person might need in return. This rage is not pathological, it is necessary. It is the life force that has been compressed and distorted, finally finding its natural expression. It is the boundary-making energy that has been suppressed erupting into consciousness. It is the sacred no that has been swallowed for decades, finally demanding to be spoken. But the sensitive person is terrified of this rage. They have been conditioned to believe that anger is dangerous, that their intensity is too much for others to handle, that their authentic emotions will drive people away. They have learned to transmute their fury into sadness, their outrage into depression, their righteous anger into exhaustion and mysterious illness. Learning to feel and express this suppressed energy becomes a crucial part of the awakening process. The sensitive person must discover that anger is not the enemy of love, but often its fiercest protector. that boundaries without the energy to enforce them are merely suggestions, that sometimes the most loving thing they can do is to refuse to enable another's unconsciousness, even if that refusal triggers conflict. This reclamation of their aggressive energy transforms everything. The person who once bent like a reed in every wind discovers they have a spine made of steel. The one who absorbed every emotional storm learns to stand unmoved in the center of chaos. The individual who once disappeared into others' needs finds their own ground and refuses to abandon it for anyone's comfort. But this newfound strength comes with its own dangers. The pendulum of consciousness often swings from one extreme to another before finding its center. The newly awakened sensitive person may become rigid where they once were formless, harsh where they once were accommodating, cold where they once were overly warm. They may mistake cruelty for honesty, abandonment for boundary setting, indifference for self-protection. This overcorrection is part of the process. It is the psyche experimenting with new ways of being, testing the limits of what is possible. The person who has never said no must learn to say it with conviction before they can learn to say it with grace. The one who has never prioritized their own needs must sometimes swing into apparent selfishness before finding the balance between self-care and genuine service. During this phase of overcorrection, relationships often reach crisis points. People who benefited from the sensitive person's endless accommodation feel threatened by their newfound boundaries. They may attempt to guilt the awakening person back into old patterns, questioning their motives, criticizing their changes, lamenting the loss of the person they once knew. These reactions reveal the true nature of many relationships that the sensitive person thought were based on love. When someone's primary response to your awakening is complaint rather than celebration, when they mourn your newfound strength rather than rejoice in it, when they attempt to shame you back into self-abandonment, they reveal that their attachment was to your diminishment rather than your wholeness. This revelation can be devastating. The sensitive person may discover that their closest relationships were built on their willingness to remain small, that their most cherished connections required their continued self-betrayal. They may find that people they love deeply cannot love them authentically, that those they trusted most were unconsciously invested in their continued imprisonment. The grief that accompanies these discoveries is profound. It is not just the loss of specific relationships, but the death of the belief that love and self-abandonment are synonymous. It is the collapse of the faith that being needed is the same as being valued. It is the shattering of the conviction that their worth lies in their utility to others. This grief must be fully felt, completely honored, allowed to move through the system without being rushed or minimized. It is the soul mourning not just what is lost, but what was never truly possessed. For relationships based on performance were never really relationships at all, but transactions disguised as connections, arrangements masquerading as love. From the ashes of these false connections, something new can emerge. Relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service. Connections that honor the full humanity of both parties rather than reducing one to a function in the other's life. Love that celebrates authenticity rather than demanding accommodation. But these new relationships cannot be forced or fabricated. They arise naturally when the awakened sensitive person stops performing and starts being, when they cease trying to earn love and begin expressing it from overflow rather than emptiness, when they quit attempting to prove their worth and start living from the knowledge of their inherent value. This shift from performing to being is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the awakening process. The sensitive person has become so skilled at reading others' needs and adapting to meet them that they have forgotten how to simply exist without a role to play. They must learn to occupy space without justifying their presence, to speak without measuring every word for its impact on others, to feel without immediately seeking to discharge that energy through service. This learning to be rather than do requires tremendous courage. It means risking the possibility that they might be boring without their constant performance of helpfulness. It means facing the fear that they might be ordinary without their extraordinary sensitivity to others' needs. It means confronting the terror that they might be unlovable without their endless willingness to accommodate. But what the awakening sensitive person discovers is that their authentic presence is far more powerful than their performance ever was. When they stop trying to be what others need and start being who they truly are, they become a mirror that reflects back to others their own possibility for authenticity. When they cease absorbing others' emotions and start feeling their own fully, they create space for others to do the same. This presence is not passive or static, it is alive, dynamic, responsive. It can hold the full spectrum of human experience without being overwhelmed by any single aspect. It can witness pain without absorbing it, celebrate joy without losing itself in it, confront darkness without being consumed by it. From this place of grounded presence, the sensitive person's gifts finally serve their intended purpose. Their empathy becomes a tool for truth rather than a mechanism for avoiding truth. Their intuition guides their own life rather than being constantly deployed in service of others' unconsciousness. Their compassion empowers rather than enables, challenges rather than coddles, awakens rather than sedates. The awakened sensitive person learns to love from fullness rather than emptiness, to give from overflow rather than depletion, to serve from choice rather than compulsion. They discover that their greatest gift to others is not their endless availability, but their embodied authenticity, not their willingness to sacrifice themselves, but their commitment to remaining whole. This wholeness is not selfishness, it is spiritual responsibility. For the person who has learned to honor their own truth becomes capable of recognizing and reflecting truth in others. The one who has reclaimed their own power can support others in reclaiming theirs. The individual who has awakened from the trap of unconscious sensitivity becomes a beacon for others still caught in its web. But this awakening is not a destination, it is a practice. The old patterns do not disappear, but lose their unconscious grip. The temptation to slip back into accommodation and self-abandonment remains but no longer operates automatically. The sensitive person must choose consciousness moment by moment, authenticity breath by breath, truth word by word. This ongoing practice of conscious choice is what transforms sensitivity from liability to asset, from curse to blessing, from trap to gift. It is what allows the naturally sensitive person to finally use their gifts in service of awakening rather than unconsciousness, truth rather than illusion, wholeness rather than fragmentation. The world desperately needs awakened, sensitive people, not more martyrs or boundaryless helpers or emotional sponges, but conscious beings who can feel deeply without drowning, care profoundly without self-abandoning, love fiercely without losing themselves. Individuals who can hold space for transformation without trying to control it, who can witness suffering without absorbing it, who can offer support without enabling unconsciousness. Your sensitivity, once conscious, becomes a force for collective awakening. Your refusal to remain trapped gives others permission to examine their own cages. Your commitment to authenticity challenges others to question their own performances. Your embodiment of healthy boundaries teaches others that love and self-respect are not opposites but partners. But this contribution cannot be manufactured or performed. It can only emerge from your genuine awakening, your real commitment to consciousness, your actual practice of choosing awareness over automation. It flows naturally from your decision to honor your own truth rather than constantly accommodating others' comfort. The journey from trapped sensitivity to conscious sensitivity is the hero's journey of our time. It requires the courage to face the dragon of your own unconscious patterns, the wisdom to see through the illusions that have kept you imprisoned, the strength to choose truth, even when it costs you relationships, approval, or the comfortable identity you have worn for so long. This journey is not for the faint of heart. It demands everything: your illusions, your performances, your desperate need to be seen as good. But it offers everything in return: your authenticity, your power, your capacity to love from fullness rather than need, your ability to serve from choice rather than compulsion. The trap of sensitivity is real, but it is not permanent. The prison is strong, but it is not unbreakable. The patterns are deep, but they are not unchangeable. What is required is the willingness to see clearly, the courage to choose differently, and the commitment to practice consciousness until it becomes as natural as breathing. Your sensitivity is not your curse, it is your potential. Your empathy is not your weakness. It is your strength waiting to be consciously wielded. Your capacity to feel is not your burden. It is your gift waiting to be awakened from the sleep of unconsciousness. The question that remains is not whether awakening is possible, it is. The question is whether you are ready to pay the price. The death of who you thought you were, in service of who you truly are. The dissolution of the comfortable lies in favor of the uncomfortable truth. The abandonment of the familiar prison in pursuit of the unknown freedom that awaits beyond its walls.